Welcome to ChatGPT. Seriously, real, mostly non-cringy uses that make journalism better. Please welcome to the stage Ithar El-Khatatni.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing in our last featured session? I know everybody, a lot of energy. Hopefully you've all had lunch, have been awake since 6 a.m., are excited, and are excited for our last featured session of the day. I'm Ithar. I have a title. I work at Bloomberg as News Product Strategy Lead. This is my 6th O&A, and I'm running for the board this year. So you should all make sure to vote. In general, read everybody's profiles and vote. And I'm excited to introduce our panel today. First up, we have our moderator, Gideon Litchfield, who is the editor-in-chief for all editions of Wired. He left the UK 25 years ago, good choice. Went to a whole bunch of places before he moved to the US. He was editor-in-chief at MIT Technology, one of the founding editors at Quartz, and did a whole lot of roles at The Economist. Give him a round of applause.
There, I just want to say I am, as of 5 p.m. yesterday, the ex-editor-in-chief of Wired.
Ooh. Do we say congratulations? Okay, congratulations. Another round of applause. I'm sure we're excited to hear what happened or how you ended up. Next up, we have Andrew Calderon, computational journalist at the Marshall Project. He's also adjunct professor at the New School in New York City. He teaches data, design, and community engagement. Welcome. Next up, no introduction needed. We'll still give you one. Cece Wei, editor-in-chief at The Markup. I just thought I'd do, not all the guys and then Cece at the end. Markup, obviously nonprofit news publication focused on the impact of technology on society. She was also co-executive director of Open News, founded the DII Coalition for Anti-Racist, Equitable, and Just Newsrooms, assistant managing editor of ProPublica, worked at the Journal, AP, all the places eventually I want to work at, all of them. And then our last panelist of today, Mark Hansen, who only wanted me to say he teaches at Columbia Journalism School. He's inaugural director of the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, professor at UCLA. I have to do a little bit. Teaches advanced data analysis in computational journalism. He has a dog called Tig and loves landscape architecture. Please give them all a round of applause. I think they're going to put up a link up there where you can add your questions, or you also have the link. Please add your questions throughout the session. I'll be moderating them, and then at the end we'll have a 15-minute Q&A for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ithar, and thank you to my panelists. Thank you all for being here and for joining us on this last day of O&A. As I said, I am officially now ex-editor-in-chief of Wired. As I announced a few months ago, I'm leaving to focus on questions around the future of democracy and governance. But first, I'm taking a break, so you won't hear anything from me for a while. While I was still at Wired, early in the year, I became very briefly journalism famous in a very, very small way, because Wired was the first publication to put out a policy on using generative AI in the newsroom. And the policy mainly said, don't use it. And to be fair, I was reacting a little bit to the explosion in excitement about it, but also the very cringe-worthy and rather embarrassing thing that happened to one or two news outlets I won't name that started writing stories with generative AI only to discover they were full of mistakes. And so I wanted to set clear guardrails around what we were doing with AI, mostly so that our readers would know what to expect and would know that our content was still trustworthy, and also so that our journalists had a sense of what the ethics around using generative AI in the newsroom should be. But at the same time, we knew that we wanted to experiment with it and see what it could be good for. How could we apply it in ways that would not just expose everything we did to confabulation and hallucination, that would introduce errors, or that would just produce mediocre copy, which is what ChatGPT does a lot of the time. So over the last few months, I've been aware of people in many, many newsrooms doing experiments with ChatGPT in one way or another to try to see where it can be useful and where it can fit into our workflows. And so I'm really excited to have a panel of people who've been doing that and been doing it in really interesting ways for serious investigative journalism and analysis. And I've asked each of them to talk a little bit about some examples of how they have been applying it and the work that they have been doing and what they've been learning. And after that, we'll turn it into more of a discussion about other possible uses, where the guardrails should be, what to watch out for, some tips for anyone else who wants to try to apply it, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I am going to ask Andrew Calderon to start by talking about what they've been doing at the Marshall Project.
Yes, okay, so hi, it's very nice to be here with you all. I'm actually going to hop over to the podium. I prepared a couple of slides that I'm going to breeze through. I was asked to put the microphone down. Okay, so I don't know if this is up already. Okay, cool. So the Marshall Project, for those of you that don't know, is a nonprofit newsroom focused on the criminal justice system in the US. And I want to tell you a little bit about the particular use case that I've been working on. But first, I have to tell you a little bit more about a project that it's really been steeped in. And so we've been covering the issue of banned books in prison since last year. And at this point, we've written a few stories about these issues that we're seeing in the carceral system related to books being disallowed and the ways in which people who are incarcerated have difficulty either retaining or accessing books. And this all started when we specifically published or were interested in compiling a list of banned books from every single state across the country. We requested that data. We managed to get 36 lists and published 18 of them, which right now are available on the website. And the tool looks more or less like this at this point. There's a state selector, there's a little summary at the top, and then you can scroll through or click through all of the different lists that are in your specific state's Department of Corrections banned book list. As a part of that request, we also asked for the publication policies for every single state, and as you can imagine, there were many of them. We managed to get, there are 50 plus the federal system, we managed to get all of them. And so as we were talking to people about what to do with the data and what to do with these policies, what we were hearing was that the data was useful, but that what people really wanted was a way to be able to parse through all of these policies and also compare them. And it's important to note that a fundamental part of the way in which we've approached this work is through a co-design process where we've been talking to people who are close to the system, like prison educators, books to prison programs, people who are formerly incarcerated, to get a sense of what their needs are. And so when we got this feedback that people wanted to be able to understand the policies and wanted to be able to compare them, parse through them, it was around the same time that ChatGPT really started getting a lot of attention, specifically version 3.5. And so we were like, okay, maybe this is the tool that we need to be able to address this problem. And actually, I threw Beyonce into the presentation because I love Beyonce, also because I have two friends who are at her concert right now in Las Vegas, but also because I actually think that she embodies some of the ways in which we want to approach this work, which is always trying to innovate and try something new, but never forgetting where you come from and your values. And so as we were thinking about how we could use this tool with all of the questions surrounding it, all of the risks around it, we decided that we would try a small version, like a 1.0 version, where we would write notes manually of the policies, the relevant sections that people told us they were interested in, and use ChatGPT to produce a summary of those notes to save us the time to actually write through them. Eventually, we went back to the people who we spoke to, they gave us feedback, and they told us that this was good, but not really great, because what they really wanted to be able to do was know each of the features, like how to actually think about all of the sections. And so we went back to ChatGPT, we thought about that process, we iterated on prompts, and eventually were able to come up with a more robust description that had set subheads with definitions that we can point to, and then we passed the summary, the policies back into ChatGPT and asked it to group all of the relevant parts of the policies underneath the subheads. We then had 2 people go and fact check these against our notes and the policies to make sure that the information was accurate. And along the way, and we'll probably talk more about the process in detail, but along the way, basically the 4 things that I took away was that it's really important to document everything that you're doing with ChatGPT at this point when you start a process, to document the prompts. Like, I made the mistake at one point of deleting some of the prompts that I was using. I realized in retrospect that I shouldn't have done that. It's really important to consider risk analysis. So when we got the lists, when we talked to people, we said, should we actually release these lists because maybe they might end up harming people? And while we were thinking about using ChatGPT, that was something that we considered as well, and we asked people's opinions. Having a co-design process in place, actually talking to people who are close to the issue that you're interested in is fundamental, so that you're not taking a solution and applying it to a problem, but you know what the problem is, and then you can think about what the best solution is to it. And then lastly, continuing to iterate on the tools and your approach and prompts. These are kind of 4 of the takeaways, and I can say more about it as we work through the panel. And if you want to dig a little bit deeper into what our process was on generative AI in the newsroom, there's a full write-up of what our process was, the prompts that we use, how we requested information, et cetera. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. So I'll come with one question, and then we'll have more discussion afterwards. But was the process that you developed, it sounds like it saved you time in the long run for generating these summaries. How tailored did it have to be to this exact project? Or put another way, how much of this could then be reproduced or simply replicated if you were using it for a different set of documents? Would you have to start from scratch?
Yeah, those are interesting questions. So my editor and I, David Eads, we kind of have different opinions on this. I think that it saved me time, full stop, because previously when I wasn't thinking about using ChatGPT, I was saying, okay, I'm going to have to read through all of these policies, pull out the sections that are relevant to publications, books, et cetera, because they're often mixed in with mailroom policies, then figure out how to synthesize it right through it. And ChatGPT saved me a lot of time because I was able to just do that manual extraction, pass it in, and then get some summaries that I could then edit and fact check. My editor thinks that it probably worked out to being around the same amount of time, but the distribution of labor was different, right? So instead of taking all of my time and putting it into being like, oh my God, how am I gonna work through all of these policies? And I was able to just focus on iterating, experimenting, and then fact checking. And it ultimately, in our opinion, regardless, wherever you fall kind of on that analysis, led to a better product because we were able to leverage what we're really good at, which is verification and fact checking, instead of sitting there getting burnt out because I have to write sentences of what is really boring policy.
Right. Okay, so it's a great example of where it is possible, as you say, to leverage what humans are really good at and outsource the boring stuff to a machine. Exactly. Okay, Mark.
All right. Hi. Hi. So I teach at Columbia Journalism School, and a lot of my examples are going to be coming from sort of the teaching process. Journalists are in a kind of a strange position when it comes to things like ChatGPT or large language models in general, because we're tasked both to report on these technologies as well as to report with them. They offer us oftentimes new capabilities, but we don't want to end up, well, anyway, there's a kind of trade-off that has to be done. I tend to think of these models as prototyping platforms for AI systems. They allow us access to try things out in ways that we wouldn't have ordinarily been able to without a lot of hand-labeled data, perhaps some machine learning applications that have sort of opaque kind of parameters to set and things like that. This large language models function as sort of multitask learners that allow for a remarkable set of things that can happen. So my experience with ChatGPT came, well, GPT-3, I guess, came in the summer of 2022 with New York State's monkeypox reports. This is how, let's think back to last summer. Anyway, this is how New York State decided that they were going to publish their monkeypox numbers. It was sort of a paragraph which said that as of July 14, 2022, there are 414 confirmed cases, blah, 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 and every day, someone somewhere in the New York State system had to write this out. And it's, of course, not particularly helpful if you want to track what's happening day over day, because you have to somehow take it out of these paragraphs and put it into a CSV. There's a lot of fiddly NLP code that you could write to do it, or you could just say, here's a paragraph coming, summarizing the latest monkeypox statistics for New York State, give the paragraph and say, please create for me a CSV, and here's what the header looks like, and it just gives you the data. And as soon as it did that, I went, oh, this is certainly worth the price of admission, right? Translating unstructured data into structured data is a thing that we end up, in data journalism, that we do so often. Anyway, you could give it multiple days, it will pull things out, like nice date formatting this time as well. You can also do something a little bit dicier, which is to say, hey, here are a few days. What are the biggest changes in where are the biggest changes in monkeypox occurring? And then it starts to sort of give you a paragraph, and sometimes that paragraph's all right, sometimes that paragraph's You can make it a little bit better if in the prompt you add, is monkeypox on the rise? And then you add, let's think step by step. And then what it'll produce for you is a series of plausible explanations as to how it's coming to its conclusion, even though none of those have anything to do with the actual conclusion that's derived. But it has been shown that if you put something like that in the prompt, let's think step by step, your answer tends to be more accurate. The next thing you can do is to say, well, I then asked it to say, take that CSV that you've created and create, and the paragraphs, and create a template. We felt comfortable with sort of old school automation, which was templated stories. So maybe have ChatGPT, if we're not comfortable with it writing directly, maybe we're comfortable with having it write a template for us. So here in this case, we're asking for a Jinja 2 template and some code to run it. So here's the code running, and it'll give you a little paragraph that now you can deploy in your system because you trust that one. That's going from data through a template out to the world, as opposed to from data to ChatGPT to the world, where there can be confabulations and that sort of thing. So the kinds of tasks that we've been playing with are like translating tasks, structuring data, tagging data, clustering data, writing code, interviewing data sets. The number of things for newsroom applications are extreme. In terms of translation even, we can think of like translating our stories from French to English or whatever it might be. You can also view one of the durable products of data journalism as a translation problem, web scraping, right? So I want to translate from HTML into a JSON, a collection of JSON objects, and Scraper Ghost basically does this, and it works really well in a remarkable number of cases, just translating out of HTML into something that's more usable, like a table or a JSON object. So that's the relationship to language tasks. I teach the computational journalism classes, so there's a whole hoo-ha around code and teaching students how to code. And we use Colab, and Colab now is going to have a little generate button at the top. So the students are being invited to have an AI generate a first stab at code for them. ChatGPT's already, earlier last month, released its code interpreter. So here, for example, I'm basically uploading New York's monkeypox numbers and then asking for a chart of daily diagnosis counts. And it starts by saying, okay, I'll do that, but let me first load in the data and have a look. The nice thing about this particular application is that you end up getting code, and it shows you the code that it's running. So the pass-through with a template that we talked about, and now having the system create code for you, these are ways that you can check if something's going to work or not before you deploy it. You can have a look at the code. You can say, yeah, that looks all right. Of course, for teaching students how to code, it means that they have to know how to code already. But anyway, you get the point. Workflows are what's important. And I think that's going to be happening increasingly as you have systems like LangChain or OpenAI started their or introduced callable functions, which basically lets you reach out to any API on the web that you want to wrap up, and then now the AI has access to a lot more data sets and not just what it was trained on. And what you'll end up getting, or what you'll end up doing, is using the AI as a reasoning tool. Like, I need to do this, and then I need to get this, and then I need to go grab this. And you'll have a record of the different APIs that it called, so you can verify those, even though there's still a little bit of magic about why it's calling each of those. You'll at least have something that you can check. Let's see, to echo, and then I'll finish, Andrew's point about sort of socializing and like working together. The work that you're doing in GPT is sort of programming without a programming language, right? And that means that there's a lot of implicit knowledge that gets built up. Implicit knowledge like, do I give GPT some examples in my prompt? Or do I ask it to, think step by step? Or do I have it preface its answer with, I think it's, because if you do that, it has a more sincere expression of uncertainty. Or are there ways for me to make it a little bit less biased? Or maybe I can just buy 3,000 prompts from this guy, but this Facebook guy. But my point is that there's a lot of experience that's getting built up, and there should be sort of social moments around that experience. Yeah. So I'm going to end there and just also comment that it's National Dog Day, and that's my dog. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Before we started, he told me that he had a presentation of 10 to 15 minutes, and I'm very grateful to him for compressing it. Thank you, Mark. Yeah. A couple of things that I want to call out before we bring Cece up to the stage is that I think what both Mark and Andrew have talked about highlights what I think of as the granularity of where LLMs are useful and where they're not. Because when they first burst onto the scene, or when ChatGPT first burst onto the scene, everyone was really impressed. Wow, you can get it to rewrite a National Science Foundation report in the style of a Shakespeare sonnet, or things like that. But if you actually need it to be useful and reliable, it starts to break down. I think what both Andrew and Mark have shown are examples of how you have to get quite specific and granular to figure out which tasks it is actually useful for and saves you time. So with the Marshall Project, it was, you can't trust it to read reports and summarize them, but you can trust it to turn the notes that a human reader took into comprehensible text. And with the data from monkeypox, you can trust it to extract numbers from a paragraph, but you have to be a little bit more careful if you want it to infer trends in those numbers. But there are ways, as Mark was talking about, to tweak the prompt so that it is more reliable in things like inferring trends. And so it seems to me like what you're saying, Mark, there is that there is effectively a whole programming language and a programming culture emerging around ChatGPT, but unlike traditional coding languages, it's imprecise. You can't, what makes a prompt more likely to lead to reliable results is a bit of an art, saying, let's go step by step. It's not logical and obvious that would have been the case. All right. So with that, I'll ask Cece to come up and speak.
Oh, wait. Thanks, Mark, for starting the clapping for me trend. Okay, so I will go a slightly different direction, though I will share one way that the markup is using ChatGPT. But I wanted to see really quick if people, by a show of hands, could just tell me if you yourself have used ChatGPT for any reason. Just raise your hand if that's the case. Okay, and then I want you to, or keep your hands up. This will be, I won't ask you to do this for too long. I want you to keep your hand up if you have used it for work specifically. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, thanks everybody. So the way that we like to sort of think about this is that if you're thinking about, coming from a world in which journalists have been using programming, software, data already to do their work, what is ChatGPT here to offer that's different? And I think you've seen some pretty good examples of things that it can do faster, though you have to sort of audit the results a little bit, than if you had to write the code yourself. So like Mark mentioned this before, like if you really wanted to get that monkeypox sentence out, you could spend a really long time coding it if ChatGPT didn't exist yet, and then eventually getting the results, but it can do it a lot faster. One thing that I've sort of noticed is that this sort of like using ChatGPT for the really serious investigative journalism stuff comes from a place where you also practice using it for the not serious, fun, personal stuff. So that's one of the reasons why I asked this question. So I'll start out with the serious stuff that we are using for it now, but I also want to give an example of not serious stuff because like all tools, it requires kind of practice. And if you practice starting with the most intensive, high-stakes thing you could do with it, it doesn't leave you a lot of room to sort of experiment and fail and learn the little quirks. So one of the recent stories that the markup has done is about how yet again, there's something going on with AI that's not fair and is a little biased. And the particular story that we've been following is the fact that when it comes to this idea of cheating, right? Like when ChatGPT first came out, everybody was like, oh my God, students are gonna cheat. Now that has moved on to this moment in which all of the classic software that's made available to universities is incorporating AI detection tools, right? Like did your student turn in something that includes something that it thinks it was written by AI? And there was a study published recently. Oh, I guess I should pull it up. But there was a study published recently, and we talked to some folks and did some testing ourselves as well about the fact that when it comes to people who are non-native English speakers, they are much more likely to be flagged as their writing is secretly AI, even though they wrote it themselves. And the implication of this, right, in schools was that we even talked to professors who didn't necessarily believe it, but because it was flagged, they had to have a conversation with their student. And students were able to prove again and again that they did the work. And we even talked to a professor in which he literally worked with the student on the outline of the essay, everything, and then ChatGPT flagged it, or sorry, not ChatGPT, but the specific tools had flagged it as AI. And so the paper itself did an experiment that was basically about why is this the case? And so it compared TOEFL essays, which is the essays that students, the test that students need to take to prove their English language proficiency if they want to come into the US and study. And they compared those to just regular like 8th grade kid essays in America and tried to see if there was a difference. Because if you're just thinking about sort of like proficiency with the language, is that it? Well, it turns out 8th grade essays from kids who are in America right now, their essays are flagged way less often than those TOEFL entrance exam essays. And at the end of the day, it was about sentence structure. And if you think about how ChatGPT was created, right, it's about the most common language uses that we see over and over again everywhere. And so as you are learning English yourself as a human being and then writing your essays in English, it mirrors more closely to how ChatGPT writes English. And so these students were having their tests and essays scored automatically saying it was written by AI when it wasn't. So here's where I give you the example of how one could use ChatGPT. So something that we're looking into right now, because we have access to some of these tools, right, is what else can we sort of figure out with this? And instead of it as a data technique per se, what we're looking into is having ChatGPT generate a bunch of essays in different styles for us to test, as opposed to using sort of real student essays and seeing if by tweaking certain things, the actual tool itself will give different results. And so this is just a different sort of angle of using ChatGPT to give you high volumes of content that you can shape to actually audit a totally separate piece of technology. And that's a lot of the sort of interest that the markup has had so far in terms of how we can use it. So with that, I'll also share with you a fun example because our CEO, Nabiha Syed, is brilliant at using ChatGPT for personal things. So for folks out there who have perhaps young children in your life that love story time, and would really love for you to tell them a story on a whim. Well, we actually ended up doing a piece on this called The Very Hungry Algorithm, Bedtime with ChatGPT. Nabiha has 2 very young kids, and now they are very into custom stories written for them based on what they're interested in that are bedtime stories. And you can tell ChatGPT something like, write me a story about, and then you can Mad Lib it, like astronauts, but in 1850, in the style of Berenstain Bears. And it will write you a pretty delightful story that you can then read. And now they sort of play this game of Mad Libs of like, what are the 2 nouns? Or what's the noun and the place, right? And then ask ChatGPT to generate that story for them. And I share this just because like, I think we need the whimsy in order to also innovate and come up with the sort of techniques that we want to use on the things in our journalism. And I just thought this was like a very, very fun example. And then I'll share one last thing. For those of you out there, especially because we're at ONA, if you are on TikTok, I feel like the ONA crowd is more likely to be on TikTok, and you want more examples of how anyone can use ChatGPT or AI overall just to sort of like brainstorm and get ideas out there, I highly recommend going to TikTok for this reason. This particular account I love, Rachel Woods from the AI Exchange, she'll teach you pretty much anything you want, all in the length of a TikTok video. So I just want to throw that out there as an example of the abundant amount of accessible resources on this. It can be overwhelming, so don't like go down a black hole, but there's a lot out there, and so if you are feeling like playing around with it into your projects has been difficult, I highly recommend just casually browsing this kind of thing. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cece. So it's important to have fun. All right, maybe we'll start by I'm curious what each of you picked up on or thought was interesting about what the others were saying. Like what stood out to you? What ideas did it give you? Possible future applications, additional things, or questions to each other about the projects you've been working on?
So I really love the way that CC framed like the whimsy, but also because I was having trouble thinking about like how to talk about what we did without making it seem inaccessible. And so I just want to give a couple of other examples of the way in which, so for example, I've used ChatGPT to simulate conversation from different perspectives on an issue. I've also used it to tell me, we were thinking about building a really small like Slack bot, and I have never done that before, and I'm very comfortable coding, and I'm sure if I started looking at the documentation I could figure it out, but I was like, I don't even know how to think about building it. And so I explained to ChatGPT what I wanted to do and said, just explain to me what the steps would be to do this thing. And that's let's just say a genre in ChatGPT that I've used on countless occasions for other things, putting together a presentation. Maybe I should have used it for this presentation. And so as a way of testing my knowledge and also helping me kind of create a meta structure around some of the things that I'm unfamiliar with to even get a sense of where to start.
I'll add one more just because I'm inspired by this, but all of you probably understand that the art of headline writing is definitely an art. And while I'm not willing to let ChatGPT read our articles ahead of time and then tell me what headline it would write, as we are writing headlines for investigative pieces, you know how tricky it is, right? It's like exactly the right word needs to be used. And I'm often like, could we have done better? And so after we publish, I will run the published piece through ChatGPT and I'll ask for it to write like 10 headlines. And now it's really just become an affirmative therapy tool where it can't do better than what we did. And so I feel great about that. But the moment that it is able to provide something, I will learn from that, right? To be like, oh, we could have been creative in this way. And like, I find it pretty affirming when I'm like, ChatGPT can't get the nuance of why I can't say that over and over, or, so I'll just throw that out there.
I can add one. So we, for the projects we fund at our institute, there's usually like a poster attached to it every year, like a thumbnail. And this year I wanted to do monochrome landscapes, right? These are satellite images that are basically one color. Because from the standpoint of like generative image work, right, these are like null spaces, right? Because there's no feature to them. And so But satellite imagery is not organized according to color, right? You can't say, give me all the blue areas or whatever. So, but you can ask ChatGPT just for the heck of it. And I said, so please, give me a monochrome places with monochrome, the orange and yellow and black and green and white and pink and it found a place for each of them. Even the pink. There's a Lake Hillier in Australia that is entirely pink. And I was like, and it gave the lat long, and it explained why it happened. I just want to emphasize here, by the way, this moment where we're sharing something and trying to kind of come to terms with the technology is a sort of important thing. I think that at Columbia we're starting to organize. Initially, they were supposed to be the second Tuesday of every month, or Thursday, rather, of every month. Second Thursday every month, STEM. I thought that was awesome, but it has to be like Wednesdays instead, so it's SWEM. It doesn't quite work. But it's just where we get together and people have their own projects, or maybe we'll suggest one for the evening, and everyone has that moment, like you'll be sitting next to someone and you'll have done something and you'll turn the laptop and go, look what this just did. And the point is because I'm not some crazed techno-positivist, but the point is to start to unlock some of that implicit knowledge, to share something, to say, well, why did that work the way it did? There's something about the kind of socializing that programming process that I think is important.
Sorry. So I think where I wanted to go with that is, my sense so far is that all of the uses that seem useful for LLMs in journalism are about, I guess, I don't know if I want to call them incremental, but they're improvements to workflow. They help with a specific bit of a process. Does any of you see something, I don't know, I guess more transformative that kind of really is a force multiplier for journalists in a serious way, or allows us to do things that we couldn't have done before?
Well, I mean, going back to the example that I gave, I think if you scale that up a bit, it is a force multiplier. So for example, taking these documents that are already publicly available and then translating them for a specific audience at, hopefully a reading level that's accessible to them. Maybe, for example, we're doing coverage in Cleveland and there's a very large rate of illiteracy there. And so we've been thinking too about what does it mean to create content for that audience? What does it mean to maybe have an audio version of some of these things, because that's the way in which some people consume. And so anyway, I think translating, the phrase I've been using is decoding bureaucracy for people is a really tremendous application of this that doesn't force us to have to put in information that maybe then the model is going to absorb or ingest, and that OpenAI is going to use in ways that we're skeptical about. I think there's tremendous territory for us to cover just in terms of publicly available information that could potentially be a force multiplier.
Yeah, sorry, go on, Mark. Well, that makes me think of a little frustration I had a little while ago. I was trying to figure out what the recycling policies were in Berkeley, California, where I was spending some time. And it's actually surprisingly hard to find out what do you do with a milk carton in Berkeley. And there are dozens of sites that will claim to tell you the answer, and you can't really trust any of them. And to what Mark was saying earlier about unstructured data, there is a huge amount of unstructured data out on the internet, and it is all in different formats and styles and different websites. But something like recycling policies across all of the country's municipalities, if you could find a way to extract that data, that could be a really useful tool. Does that feel like something plausible? Mark.
Yes. I don't, not knowing anything about the contours of that question, sure. I think I want to sort of underscore that there's a little bit of minimizing going on in the way you phrased your previous question.
Sure.
And I'm not sure that that's right. I mean, I think there are some things that, there are certain types of code now that I will not write again. Right? There's fiddly NLP stuff that I will just not write again because ChatGPT does it well enough that I don't have to worry about it. I've seen our students, you know, just last year, right? They started the year, September, you know, Colab notebooks open or Jupyter notebooks or whatever it was, you know, learning Python, whatever. And then over the course of the year, you know, either Cody or Copilot or you know, one of these other systems, like these coding assists, like cropping up, right? And the places that they could get to education-wise, because they were able to ask questions about error state, you know, about error, like, you know, ours error reporting is horrible, right? The error messages that you get, and so having something like clarify what that means is amazing. And I also think, to Cece's point from the headlines, there's also something that happens when you play off our professional practice against what this thing does, right? And it throws us back to thinking about how we're doing our jobs. It throws us back to thinking about labor in kind of a fundamental way, and what does it mean when a human's doing it versus this, you know, a computer, you know, where is inspiration coming from? Where is all that? Like I think it forces us to stop and think about some of those processes, like you had done for when you set sort of Wired's publication standards. We have to come back and think about how we do things.
Has anything that any of you have seen and the experiments you've been doing given you pause or made you say, whoa, this is something we could do, but we really shouldn't do?
I mean, many things. I think, you know, this is related to the question you just asked as well, which is there are transformative things that I can imagine and rather look forward to that I don't trust LLMs to be able to do today, but I think that they could, right? But they just have all sorts of issues. So it's sort of like we're not willing to use it for output currently because it's just not output. Right? Like the things we actually publish, because it's not good enough for that. And it's proven that over and over again, but it's really good at the ideation phase, the helping you sort of process phase, and that is powerful and accelerating. In terms of what I imagine that would be really nice is like, you know, ChatGPT is known for all of the bias issues it has because of what it gets to train off of, right? Like it's just a human problem, right? Like we cause that problem. But if you can imagine a world in which you could do at scale the types of things that human reporters have tried to do recently. So for example, a couple years ago, the LA Times had published a piece in their sort of like food section with the assumption that as a reader, you knew what certain types of Chinese food were already and didn't need that explained to you, and then added as the second annotation layer, the explanation, right? Versus the original default of let's explain this to everyone because our assumption is that our readers won't get it. Imagine if you could do that at scale for all of your journalism, right? Write it for exactly the person reading it and having those iterations of it, having plain language versions of all of our articles so that they're accessible, right? Like those are things that we could do, but are so manually intensive if we wanted to do it for everything and in every way. But I can't trust ChatGPT to automate that yet. But I think there is a world in which, as it gets better, as we decide to train it better and to sort of create less of that bias and give it sort of more to work from, there is a world in which suddenly our journalism could become way more accessible than it is now.
Yep. A use that I would be excited for, and I sort of can see being possible, would be a way for a layperson to get access to query a specialized body of knowledge. Meaning, for example, if I want to ask like a simple dumb question about Supreme Court precedent around some kind of issue, or I want it to teach me Kant's concept of the categorical imperative in simple terms, like for a high schooler, or you know things like that, where you have, instead of having to read through a whole bunch of knowledge to get familiar with it, you can ask a specific question and learn. And does that feel like something that we might expect?
I think so. Yeah, we've been talking at the Marshall Project. I mean, not to say that's something we're ready to do by any means, but just as we've brainstormed, that's something that we've thought about. You know, both making a lot, because the criminal justice system is so fragmented and so vast and so localized, like what would it mean to make some of these very complex policies accessible to people and queryable, and to really make it actionable for someone to ask questions. And then just to take a step back, because I wanted to add something. So for example, with my example of the policies and making them comparable, the reason that even came up was because somebody who's a prison educator said, what would be really great is if I could go to the warden and say, Alabama is doing this, or New York, Alabama, North Carolina are doing this. Why don't we have an appeals policy? Why don't we have this caveat built in? And if they could point to where in the policy that's happening, it creates all kinds of opportunities for accountability just by the sheer fact of making it easier to work through these documents and these rules. Not to hammer on the point, but just to...
I know Ithar has some questions for us from the audience, but I actually want to ask just one more before we go to that, which comes back to what you said, Mark, earlier about learning to give prompts that make it more accurate, and learning basically what is the implicit coding language of prompt engineering. The question I have is, how do you see a community of practice and of knowledge emerging around using LLMs for journalism, which would be the prompt engineering equivalent of GitHub, right? Of having code repositories that anyone can tap into to understand how to get results.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of work already happening on GitHub, and it's sort of fun to read through, like Scraper Ghost, for example, or any of these things that have a call to OpenAI's API at the core, because you search around the GitHub for a little bit and eventually you find the prompt, right? And it's you are something or other, because you should give it a personality. So you are something or other. You would like to do this. I would like you to, and you where there's all the Python and all that stuff around it. Eventually, there's just the thing that gets sent to ChatGPT or to GPT-4 or whatever it might be. That's just sort of really beautifully, a little beautifully written thing. I will say that there have been a number of attempts in the HCI community to try to, or HCI researchers to try to put some structure, like some programming structure, to try to make templates for how you would talk to a large language model to make sure that it performs well, so that it starts to be maybe something in between a formal coding language and just natural language. But I'm not sure how that'll play out.
Cool. All right, Ithar, I believe you have some audience questions.
Yeah, a couple of questions, and feel free. We still have 15 minutes to add more questions if they've popped up for you. One question from Anna J. at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Do you ever crowdsource a solution from multiple LLMs, like Google Bard, ChatGPT, and others, or is ChatGPT the only one they should be bothering with for now?
I think you should definitely try. I'm looking at you because you asked the question. Although I know that there's a person somewhere else who owns the question, so it's a very disconcerting. There you go. Hello. I think you should definitely try, because they have different characteristics. Like the new version of Claude allows you to put there's like a huge context window, right? And so you can try things out that are much longer than you could with others, and so that's important. And I think there was a rumor for a while that GPT-4 isn't in fact just one large language model. It's like 8 of them that are voting. So it's like a mixture of experts. So instead of having one gargantuan model, it's sort of 8 smaller models that, yeah, sorry.
Okay. Another question, someone who did not want to be identified. For using ChatGPT at work, smaller things, using SEOs, summaries, subject lines, but not having leadership still being on board and having to hide it from them like I'm watching porn or something. What's the elevator pitch to get more legacy, more traditional on board?
That's a good question. Okay, well, I'll tackle this in one way, because it's kind of, the core part of this is like why, try to get at the answer of like, why is leadership not on board? And is it because they're worried about publishing inaccuracies? Is it because they don't know enough about the tool? Like that plays a part. But I'll pick just one thing, which is that it's possible that a great way to convince people to show them a way in which it could actually be really useful for them. as leadership. So I'll give you an example, and this is something that I can't take credit for. I think Siri Carpenter, who is here from the Open Notebook, I'm on her board, and I got to hear her talk about a way she used ChatGPT that I thought was brilliant, which was as she was looking into fundraising and who she could ask to be a funder of the Open Notebook, which is all about creating resources for science journalists, right? She knows who her current funders are, and she asked ChatGPT to basically go look for all of the funders that basically like have a high chance of funding the Open Notebook, and then ranking them by like how close they might be. And then she could validate it by seeing if whether or not the people who already fund her are at the top, and that was the case. And so then she could go down and research everybody, right? And like, that's a brilliant use of it. And I think one of those things is like, if one of the blockers for leadership is that they don't understand it, et cetera, you can, figure out how to get past that. But having a good example of how leadership could use it for their job might also do the same piquing of the curiosity that allows people to sort of open up a little more.
I'll also just plug that we put together a resource doc that's kind of the design is need-based. So like I am, and there's a specific section for exactly this use case with a bunch of links that we've thrown in there. If, I don't know where to find the link to that resource doc, but it exists.
I think the link, we will post it up, and it is going to, I think it's on the O&A page, right? Yes.
The other thing is, you have to be really, you have to remember that the stuff you put into one of these systems is like going out of your control, right? So it's going to a company, and that company has, published rules about how it's going to use your data or whatever. It may use your data to improve its functions and what have you. And so employers may have really good reasons why they don't want you using these things for work applications because you're sending valuable data off. And that, that's something to consider.
Yeah, 100%. Like, one way potentially is to help sort of figure out how to define those things. Like, for example, I would never let our reporters put our drafts into ChatGPT, right? Because I have no guarantee about what's going to happen once that is out there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had a little experience recently where I wrote a piece, and then just for kicks, I put it through GPT-4 and asked it to edit it down because I wanted it to be shorter. And the first thing I learned is that it can't count. And I said, edit this down to 525 words, and it gave me 730. So then I said, all right, try it. Oh, no, well, actually, I think it was the other way around. It edited it down to 330. And I said, okay, I want this longer. And it gave me about the same length. And I said, okay, edit it down to 700 words, and it gave me 450. So I had to kind of approach the number by guesswork. And the second was the edits that it gave me, first of all, had mistakes in them because it misinterpreted some of what I was saying. And also it wasn't quite in my voice. And so I didn't accept any of the edits. And yet it was useful. And the reason it was useful was that it caught places where my phrasing was flabby or used too much passive voice or just, and I was like, oh, you're right. I would change that. Let me just think what I would change it to rather than what the machine would change it to. So, I know, maybe have leadership run their things through it and then use that as a self-critique.
If I could also just add one more strategy. So I wasn't dealing with this culture problem at the Marshall Project at all, but the way that I got to the point now where we have like a working group and we're talking about guidelines is that I would just collaboratively work with reporters and other people with ChatGPT, and we would do like reporting exercises together, like generating lists of sources. And so then there was enough, I feel like part of how we got to where we are now is that there was enough excitement from different people that I was talking to, and it was a part of the conversation, that it was something that needed to then be addressed at a larger level in the organization, and guardrails needed to be set around it for experimentation, et cetera. And so that could potentially be a strategy.
A good segue, I guess, for that, beyond reporters, for students. From Layla, who's a student at university, what's a use case for them, or how would you recommend students learn how to use or experiment with ChatGPT if they're still early on about learning about the principles of journalism to begin with, and should they be?
I mean, I think this was mentioned before, but having a project, right, to start on. I'm not the words person, so I'm not going to be the one to say, oh, have it rewrite what did you call it, flabby something? Like have it rewrite my flabby, what a horrible thought. But so I'm not likely to have one of these editorial or language-based skills, but instead, here's some data that I would like to think about. Here's a set of regulations about recycling. How would I deal with that? Like come to it with a project and then see how it proves useful or not. Even everything like, how would I approach this project? And it'll give you a set of things. Like, it's usually not very inspired when you get to that point, but it at least shows you stuff you would have thought of, and then you feel a little better about it, and you get to see how it works. And I would also play with the language a little bit. Sometimes these sort of non-programming programming language, like natural language is a really horrific interface, right? Small changes in words can have big changes in output, and that's just awful, right, as a thing. And so figuring out where there are sensitivities, figuring out, that sort of thing is another thing. And sometimes even asking it to try, how would I make this better? And seeing if you can get something that that falls more in line with what it's expecting. And I'm not anthropomorphizing it. It doesn't actually expect anything. It is a constructed, non-living thing.
So I brought it into my classroom almost as soon as it was launched, or 3.5. And it reminds me of what you were saying about play. So like the way I introduced it to the class, we had a project and everyone had to have a final project at the end, and the class is about design and community engagement. But initially the introduction was just like, here's this thing, sign up if you want to, because some people felt really uncomfortable about it, and I wanted to respect that too. And then just play around with it. And then as a group, we just talked about what people were putting in and what they were getting. And by the end, so there were 18 people, by the end there were about 4 or 5 people that felt so excited about it that they started figuring out ways to build it into their project for ideation, for coding help. And so they themselves saw the utility in it and thought about the problems that they could potentially throw at it, or sometimes I would nudge them if they were excited about it.
Yeah, I'll say one more thing for students, which is I highly recommend using ChatGPT to do things that you currently use other things for. For example, instead of using thesaurus.com, use ChatGPT. I recommend this because when I'm futzing with language, I frequently want something to happen, and I'm looking at thesaurus or something like that to try to find the right word because I'll know it when I see it. And what I've started using ChatGPT to do is okay, I'm writing a sentence. Maybe it's for an email or something, right? And what I really want is 3 words that alliterate, but I'm missing the last one, and I know what that word is supposed to mean. And I'll ask ChatGPT for 10 options for what word could go there but starts with M, right? And it's just, there's something about the playness of it that I think will help. And for students especially, just across all the random tools that tech already does for you, just try using some of those things in ChatGPT, because you'll get different ways to customize it and different funny things that come out of it. I'm pretty sure for my staff as well, one of the most fun pastimes is just purposely getting ChatGPT to make mistakes. It's really easy if that's your goal. And they love posting the results. And it's just, yeah.
Do we have one more question?
We have many, but I know we're coming up on time, so maybe one more. Can you recommend a few specific ways to analyze data in a spreadsheet if you're particularly looking for outliers, patterns, or any other helpful reporting leads that a human could then further explore?
So I had mentioned the GPT plugin code interpreter. It allows you to ask questions of a data set, through just basic natural language, make a plot for me, or what is the average of, or do a Wilcoxon rank test for. Anyway, but there's a variety of things that you can just ask it for, right? And the nice thing about Code Interpreter is, as I mentioned, it produces some Python, so it's taking your request. There's some text that comes back that says, I think you're looking for this, and then it produces some code. And it's always better when you have this thing produce some code, because then you know, all right, like I can see what that's supposed to do. I can work through it. So there's code interpreter. That's going to cost something. You have to, at the moment, sign up for ChatGPT Plus. There's also something, if you're a Python programmer at all, there's Pandas AI, which allows you to, uses sort of the Pandas formalism to ask, Pandas base on which to ask questions, again, sort of in natural language about like, what does this look like and what's happening here. So Pandas AI is nice because it stays wherever your computation is, as opposed to Code Interpreter, where you have to, again, ship your data off to OpenAI. And so step one, well, if you're using Colab, you've already shipped your data off to Google, so I don't know who's better at this point, right? In that massive Rochambeau.
Okay, well, we are out of time, but I want to thank Mark, NCC, and Andrew very much for this panel. And it is not in the app right now, but if you go to ona23.journalist.org and look for the session, you will see a link to the resource list that has a bunch of links that these people have put in with all sorts of useful information if you want to put ChatGPT to work in your newsroom. Thank you. Have a good day.